It is a confounding discovery that is rocking the very foundations of what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization.
These are the big questions. I think to answer these, we have to go inside and have a closer look.
For nearly 200 years, the people who study Sumer told a simple story. The first cities of the world grew up out of the mud of southern Iraq, built by farmers who had always been there. And the world's first writing system, first laws, and first kings all sprang from one unbroken local line. It was the kind of story textbooks love, because it never asked anyone to explain a migration, a mixture, or a mystery. It just asked you to accept that a people appeared where they belonged and built something extraordinary. Then geneticists actually went looking for proof, and the proof they found did not match the story at all. To understand why the discrepancy matters, you have to understand what made Sumer strange in the first place, long before anyone had the tools to read ancient DNA. Sumerian, the language spoken and written by the people who built Uruk, Uar, and Eridu, has no known relatives. Not a distant cousin, not a dead sister language, nothing. Linguists have hunted for 100 years and found no family for it anywhere on Earth. On top of that, when Sumerian writing shows up in the archaeological record, it does not look like something being invented. It looks close to finished, as though the hard work of stumbling toward a writing system happened somewhere out of view. Scholars had a name for this puzzle long before genetics entered the picture. They called it the Sumerian problem. And for most of the 20th century, it stayed exactly that, a problem nobody could solve, so most people quietly stopped trying. The obvious next step, once ancient DNA sequencing became possible, was to just read the bones. That is how the mystery of the Neanderthals cracked open. It is how researchers trace the spread of early farmers across Europe family by family. It has worked on mammoths, on the mysterious Denisovans, on nearly every extinct or ancient human population scientists have wanted to understand. So why not the Sumerians? The answer turns out to be brutally simple. Geography betrayed them. Southern Mesopotamia, the marshy floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates, is about the worst possible environment for DNA preservation. DNA survives best in cold, dry, stable conditions. Southern Iraq offers blistering heat and heavy humidity, a combination that breaks down genetic material faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. A century of excavation in the region has produced essentially no usable ancient genomes from the people who actually lived in the Sumerian heartland. The civilization that gave the world its first written records, tablets on farming, trade, poetry, and law, left almost nothing behind that a genetics lab can read. That gap is what makes this story unsettling rather than merely academic. The Sumerians wrote down an enormous amount about themselves. We know about their gods, their kings, their taxes, their medicine, even complaints from students at their scribal schools. We know they drank beer through long reed straws to avoid the sediment, and that they divided time into units of 60. The same system still sitting on every clock face today. And yet not one confirmed skeleton has yielded a full ancient genome. A civilization that documented nearly everything left almost nothing of itself in the one language of modern science can read directly, the language written into human cells. For years, this looked like a dead end. If you cannot recover DNA from the Sumerians themselves, there is no genetic story to tell. But researchers found a workaround. And it is the workaround that eventually produced the discovery being described here. If ancient Sumerian remains will not talk, the next best option is to study the people who never left the land the Sumerians once ruled, on the theory that some thread of ancestry might have survived the fall of the cities even after the language and the name disappeared. Southern Iraq's marshlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread out before reaching the Gulf, are home to a community known as the Marsh Arabs, whose way of life has stayed remarkably stable for a very long time. They build reed houses using construction methods that closely resemble depictions in Sumerian art from 4,000 years ago. Their boats follow old regional designs. Their oral traditions tie them to that landscape across generations that stretch back further than anyone can firmly date. If any population alive today carried a genetic echo of the Sumerians, researchers reasoned it would most likely be found here. In 2011, a research team led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahiri working out of the University of Pavia in Italy, tested that idea directly. They collected DNA samples from 143 Marsh Arab men, each with documented ancestry in the marshes going back at least 4 generations, and analyzed 2 separate genetic lines. The Y chromosome passed from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child. The maternal results looked unremarkable, a fairly typical blend of Middle Eastern lineages. The paternal results did not. Roughly 74% of the men sampled carried the same single Y chromosome branch, a lineage known as J1p58. Including its broader family, haplogroup J accounted for close to 85% of every paternal line in the sample. To put that in perspective, most human populations show a wide mix of paternal lineages, dozens of branches scattered across a family tree. Finding that 3 out of every 4 men share one specific branch is one of the most concentrated paternal signals ever documented in the region, and concentration like that does not happen randomly. Something in that population's history dramatically narrowed the range of surviving male lines. Concentration was only the first surprise. The second came from tracing where that lineage actually originated. Geneticists locate the birthplace of a lineage by looking for where its internal genetic diversity is highest, because a lineage accumulates the most variation in the place it has existed the longest. When al-Zahiri's team mapped J1p58 this way, its deepest roots were not in southern Iraq at all. They pointed north toward upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Turkey, with fainter genetic threads extending toward Oman, the Ethiopian highlands, and the eastern Mediterranean. In other words, the dominant paternal line among the population researchers consider the closest living approximation of the Sumerians did not appear to originate on Sumerian soil. It looked like it had traveled in from somewhere else, likely moving down along the river systems before settling in the south. That detail forced a follow-up question. When did this lineage actually spread? Y chromosome lineages carry a kind of molecular clock. Small, steady mutations accumulate generation after generation at predictable spots, and by counting them, researchers can estimate roughly when a branch underwent a sudden expansion, the genetic signature of a small group rapidly growing and spreading outward. When al-Zahiri's team ran that calculation on J1p58, the estimate came out to approximately 4,500 years ago. That number lines up strikingly well with the height of Sumerian civilization, the period when Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu were flourishing as true cities, with monumental temple architecture, organized government, and a fully developed writing system supporting dense urban populations for the first time in human history. The coincidence is dramatic enough that it is tempting to call this the moment the Sumerian bloodline was captured in the genetic record. A handful of powerful men whose descendants outcompete everyone else's lineage across the following 4.5 millennia. It would be irresponsible to stop there, though, because that clean number comes with an enormous asterisk. The dating method used carries a margin of error of roughly plus or minus 2,600 years, which means the actual expansion of J1p58 could have happened anywhere from about 7,000 years ago, long before Sumerian cities existed, to as recently as 2,000 years ago, long after Sumer had already fallen and been absorbed into later empires. That is not a small margin. It is wide enough to swallow most of Mesopotamian history. Beyond the dating uncertainty, there is a second, harder problem. The Marsh Arabs' unusually uniform paternal line does not have to mean anything Sumerian at all. Small, geographically isolated populations frequently lose genetic diversity over time simply through random drift, unrelated to any particular founding event. A community that stayed relatively closed off in the marshes for centuries could end up with one dominant paternal lineage purely as a side effect of isolation, with no connection to ancient kings or city builders whatsoever. The genuinely important breakthrough, and the one that reframed the entire question, came in 2022 from a Harvard-led team headed by geneticist Iosif Lazaridis. Rather than working with modern populations as a proxy, they managed to recover the first confirmed Neolithic genomes from Mesopotamia, pulled not from the deadly climate of the south, but from cooler sites in the north where preservation was possible. What they found undercut both of the old competing theories at once. The people of Neolithic northern Mesopotamia were not a single, static local population waiting to become Sumerian. They were already a blend of at least three distinct ancestral streams: hunter-gatherer ancestry from the Levant to the southwest, ancestry connected to early Anatolian farmers to the north, and a substantial stream flowing in from the Caucasus and the Zagros Mountains to the east, in what is now western Iran. That eastern stream is the detail that undoes the old textbook story completely. It shows that the floodplain was never simply the birthplace of Mesopotamian culture in isolation. It was a destination that people had been migrating toward for thousands of years before the first Sumerian city ever existed. Even the Ubaid culture, long treated as the pure local root from which Sumer supposedly grew untouched, turns out to have already carried this mixed ancestry. There was no purely local starting point to return to. The mixture came first. That earlier mixing pattern connects unexpectedly to something in Sumerian religious tradition that scholars have long treated as pure mythology. Sumerian texts repeatedly describe the mountains to the east as the origin point of the gods and of civilizations' founding gifts. For a long time, this was read simply as symbolic storytelling with no historical basis. The genetic evidence does not prove the myths were literal memory, and it would be overreaching to claim it does. But it is striking that the ancestral flow researchers can trace archaeologically and genetically moves in the same direction those stories always pointed, down out of the eastern highlands and into the river valleys. Once you widen the lens from the tightly isolated marsh Arabs to the broader Iraqi population, the genetic picture grows far more layered. Among Iraqis generally, that same J1 lineage drops to roughly 31%, while lineages nearly absent among the marsh Arabs appear in significant numbers, including haplogroup J2 at around 24%, R1 lineages near 21%, and haplogroup T at about 6.5%. Those additional lineages trace back to the long procession of peoples who moved through or conquered Mesopotamia over the following 4,000 years, including Akkadians, Amorites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks under Alexander, Arab tribes, Mongols, and Ottoman Turks. Each wave left a genetic mark. What stands out is the asymmetry between how that mark shows up in paternal versus maternal DNA. Roughly 30% of Iraqi Y chromosome lineages trace to these outside populations, but on the maternal side that figure drops to closer to 9%. The pattern this suggests is that the armies, traders, and rulers who arrived over the centuries were overwhelmingly male, while the women of the land largely stayed in place, carrying the older Mesopotamian maternal lines forward relatively undisturbed through every political upheaval layered on top. Strip away those later arrivals, and the deep genetic foundation shared across modern Iraqis, the marsh Arabs, Assyrian communities, Iraqi Jewish populations, and Mandean communities all points back to the same ancient Mesopotamian core, distributed unevenly by history, but never fully erased by it. This is not simply a matter of historical curiosity either. Understanding these lineage differences has practical value for modern medicine, since population-specific genetic variation affects how groups process certain treatments and their susceptibility to particular conditions. What makes all of this genuinely strange, rather than just an interesting footnote, is the collision between two completely different lines of evidence. Judged purely by language, the Sumerians look like the most isolated people who ever existed, speaking something with no relatives anywhere in the historical or linguistic record. Judged by ancestry, they look like the opposite, a population built from constant mixing with neighbors to the west, north, and east across thousands of years. A culture is not supposed to be able to be linguistically unique, while being genetically unremarkable in its degree of mixture, yet that appears to be exactly what happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Language and biology were simply never obligated to tell the same story, and Sumer is the clearest known case where they diverge so sharply. None of this is finished science, and the researchers involved have been careful not to oversell it. The 2022 Harvard paper does not claim to have located a single point of Sumerian origin, and responsible geneticists have been explicit that the marsh Arab data shows correlation with the timing of Sumerian urbanization rather than proof of direct descent. What both studies converge on is more modest, and in a way, more interesting than a clean origin story. The people who eventually became Sumerian were not a race that appeared from nowhere, nor a population that grew in isolated purity from one patch of riverbank. They were the product of thousands of years of movement and mixture across the wider region, condensing into cities at almost exactly the moment their genetic and cultural signature seems to explode across the record. The piece still missing is the one that would settle this definitively. Actual ancient DNA recovered directly from Sumerian remains in the south, from sites like Uruk or Eridu, rather than inferred from their descendants thousands of years removed. That evidence remains locked behind the same obstacles that have always stood in the way: a punishing climate that destroys DNA, archaeological sites buried under modern cities, and regions where excavation has been disrupted for decades by conflict and instability. Until that changes, everything known about Sumerian ancestry will remain an inference built from the blood of the living rather than a fact read from the dead. What the genetic record does make clear, even with all its uncertainty, is that the tidy origin story taught for 2 centuries never held up. The people who built the world's first cities were not a pure bloodline, discovered fully formed on the riverbank. They were a convergence, one that still shows up, diluted and reshuffled by everything that came after, in the DNA of people living in Iraq today.